Hello to all my viewers, this is Magicalamazing, and today's video is going to be on the steps I took to make my cardboard Ruger Precision. The first step was to sketch a full-scale drawing of the gun onto a piece of paper, or nearly 3 in this case, and if you'd like to know how I did that, I have videos explaining the whole process on my channel in the Tips and Tricks playlist. I'm going to start by making the side panels to the lower part of the receiver of the gun. You can see the pictures in the background here are the shapes that I cut out using my sketch as a template. Here is the right side panel. Next I'm going to cut these pieces out of uncorrugated cardboard to add a little bit more detail. And here's what they look like glued on. The left side is going to be a little bit more tricky because I don't have a picture of it. I'm just going to use reference pictures that I found online to decide what shapes to cut out, and you can see in the background here roughly the shapes that I used. They're basically the same as the parts that I used on the right side, except there's no gap for the bolt handle because there is no bolt handle on this side. Here's what the left side looks like without the extra details put on, so now it's time to add them. To do that, I'm going to use uncorrugated cardboard to add this shape to it. Then I'm going to add the bump to this side by cutting out this shape, and I'm going to taper the edges. I do this by removing a little bit of the corrugation around the edge and cutting out some shapes that I'll be able to glue on at an angle to make it look like this. Then I simply glued it onto the side. Here I covered the corrugation of the edges, and you can see how they're layered from the shapes that I cut out earlier. The last bit to do was add these 2 strips along the top of either side and cover the corrugation on them, and that was pretty much the side panels done. Here's what they looked like. To start with the upper portion of the receiver, I'm going to cut out a strip of cardboard like this, and cut out a couple holes, one for the ejection port and one for where the bolt will ride. I then made that strip into this shape you see here. This video shows that I'm going to be lining the inside with a piece of paper, but it also shows that the part is not actually a circle. It's actually an octagon, with only 2 opposite sides being shorter than the others, though it probably wouldn't look very different if you actually made it into a cylinder. It was at this point that I attached the 2 sides of the lower part of the receiver together, though I totally forgot to take a picture of that step. I can, however, show you with these green lines where I attached cardboard strips to the edges to connect them. Notice I left the back, top, and magazine well open. To start on the bolt, I'm going to make a cylinder like this, and it's going to fit inside the part I just made. The bolt handle started out as these 4 pieces. They are actually all the same shape, they're just bent in slightly different ways, and here's what it looks like when they're all glued together. 2 of them are non-corrugated, so I didn't have to waste time covering all the corrugation. I cut out these pieces, and they're going to be attached to the end of the bolt handle to approximate the shape of the ball on the end. Here's what I mean by that. I then put some paper on one side of the tube and put the handle right on the edge. I'll show you exactly where in this video here. Here's the top part of the receiver after I removed the paper from the holes and covered the corrugation. And you can see when I insert the bolt into it, the cardboard side is going to go just far enough to cover the ejection port. The balance on the other side is what I covered in white paper. It is just for looks, and you don't have to do that if you don't want to. Here's another picture showing that I did indeed cover the corrugation on the inside of the ejection port and the bolt handle cutout. I'm going to start making the grips by cutting out this shape here, and then I'm going to mirror it. The pattern you see there for the grip texture, I just cut through the top layer of cardboard and I removed the corrugation to leave the lines. Again, this is personal preference. If you have another idea for a grip texture, go for it. I then went ahead and attached the 2 halves together. Now, it's really not important what these 2 shapes look like because no one's going to see them. They're going to be on the inside of the gun. Just know that I cut out these shapes to give the handle a little bit more rigidity, because otherwise I would just be gluing it edge to edge with the rest of the gun. The trigger guard is made of these 3 pieces. None of them are corrugated because they are small and have a lot of little bends, and this is not a part that needs to be extremely strong. Then I glued it on. To begin the process of making the joint between the receiver and the stock, I'm going to cut out this piece here, and then I'm going to cover the corrugation pretty much all the way around it. I'm then going to glue it onto the receiver like this. Note that the top is as close to flush with the bottom of the bolt handle cut out as possible. This picture is here just to show you the approximate size and shape of the next part that I'm going to make. After a little bit of messing around and some covering of the corrugation, this is the part that I ended up with. It's going to be put on the back of the gun where you see here. Notice that there is free space all the way around the bolt. That space is going to be taken up by this part here, which is just a big cylinder with a cutout for where the bolt handle will be, which I inserted into the rear of the gun. This is pretty much the only place that your stock is going to connect to the rest of the gun, so make sure it's a strong joint. Next, I'm going to make that little strip right behind the part that I just made that you can see by cutting out a strip of cardboard like this, and a little bit of a filler piece which is going to go on the inside. Here's what I mean by that. You can see that that strip is wrapped all the way around, and that little filler piece is right there. The parts of the hinge are going to be these parts here. None of this is corrugated because it's all pretty fine work, and they're going to be glued together like this. I'm also going to make that strip to the right and the little button on the bottom. The other half of the hinge is going to be made in much the same way. I'm going to start out with these pieces and then glue them together. With the first 3 pieces glued onto that strip with the button, and the next 4 already put together, here's how I attached them to the gun. This little part here is just a small detail that's going to be added to the hinge. Now I'm going to start some serious work on the details of the stock by cutting out these shapes here, and then gluing them together and attaching them to the bottom like this. I very tightly rolled a piece of paper. Here you can see how long and how wide it is, and it's going to be that little part right there. I inserted the one end into the back of the receiver and then glued the rest of it to the underside of the part I just attached. Then I remembered I had to add the stock release button detail there, so I did. The next little bit of the stock there is a castle nut, which is going to be made by this strip here wrapped around. Then I'm going to make the little part below it, which is on that paper tube, which is going to start out like this, and it's just going to wrap around like so. The strap above it's going to be made of these 3 pieces, with the strip wrapping around the top of the stock and each of those little circles being put on either side. Now this took a lot of trial and error, but these are the 3 parts that I came up with, which is going to make up that middle part there, which is the back of the tube for the stock. The important part to note is the width of the middle piece there, because that's going to be the width of the whole part. Here's what it looks like put together. Notice that I left the top part open. This is a very tightly rolled piece of paper as well, which is going to be the center adjustment bar, for which I drilled a hole through this part. I also cut a couple holes in either side and covered them in the back because I forgot to do that before, which are just aesthetic details. I then attached the whole assembly to the back of the stock. It's important when doing this to really make sure that you're pretty lined up on all of your axes, because any little bit of error you make now is going to be very noticeable when the gun is done. Next, I wrapped around a whole bunch of little strips of cardboard here, which in hindsight I probably should have done before I attached the thing to the gun. The cheek rest started with me tracing and cutting out this part here on stiff uncorrugated cardboard as a stencil. I used that stencil to make this part here by skipping a little place in the middle and mirroring it. I removed the corrugation from the cheek rest in the places you see here and cut out some replacement parts, which I then glued in. This just gives a little bit of an indent on either side. Next, I glued it onto the top of the stock tube. Another thing I didn't show was the addition of a small reinforcement piece where you see the green line here. This just goes right across the inside of the cheek rest to give it a little bit more stability. Something I often do once I get to certain points in making the gun is I will just look over the whole thing and make sure that everything's lined up and looks the way I want it to. Let's move on to that bottom part there. I cut out these 2 shapes here. They are 2 of the same exact shape. Then I went ahead and attached the 2 halves together. That cutout at the bottom is for a small bit of Picatinny rail for a monopod, I guess, and I made that by starting by pinching the edges of a strip of cardboard like this. Here you can see all the little bits. I took that piece I made before and cut it into some parts, made a strip for a base and a little riser there, and this is what it looks like once everything's glued together. The whole assembly is going to be glued onto that bottom piece in the slot like this. There should be a little bit of overhang on each side. Next, to give the illusion of rails that the stock would slide on when adjusting, I cut out these pieces here and glued them on like this. I then covered the corrugation, leaving that part in the middle there, because that's where I'm going to attach it to the rest of the stock, and glue sticks better to corrugation. Now this part took a lot of trial and error for fitting, but I left it so that I have to cut out that slot now because I knew this would be the best way to get a perfect fit. It's always easier to fit something when you have the part you're trying to match. The rearmost part of the stock that the butt pad attaches to is made of these 3 pieces. The right-hand part there has a hole cut out for the part I just made, and for the adjustment rod, which is also going to be attaching to it. You don't really need these holes, and you can save yourself a bit of time by just gluing it directly onto the back without cutting them out. However, if you do it this way, the joint is much, much stronger. Something that's pretty important with a stock that's as skeletal as this one is. The butt pad itself is also made of 3 pieces, these 2, and the one strip that's going to be covering the rearmost part. Next, I just went ahead and glued the 2 together. I made these parts here for the left side of the stock's adjusting nuts. And this is what it looks like once I've attached the butt pad and those 2 nuts. Next, I made 2 of these very, very small little dots, which will be used to take advantage of the holes I cut in the side of that center part earlier. The right-hand side of the adjusting nuts are these pieces here, with the strip in the middle just being wrapped around either side of the paper pins. Now once again, I'm going to look over the whole gun now that the stock is finished, and once again make sure that everything is pretty much the way I want it to be. In this view, you can also see where I attached the little levers I just made. The rail on top of the rifle is made the same way that I made the little one in the stock, only longer. Then I glued her on. Now comes the fun part, the barrel shroud. Or tube, as I think I've heard some people call it. This is just a very large piece of corrugated cardboard that I spent a ludicrous amount of time tracing and cutting out holes from. But the first step was to draw on the pattern. I used rulers, compasses, and a couple stencils, and a lot of time to make this pattern. I unfortunately don't have any way to transfer it directly to you, but here you can kind of see what it looks like. Before I cut out the holes, I glued it into the shape I wanted, which was this kind of octagon. Notice that 4 of the sides are shorter than the other 4. The first thing I did was go through the whole thing and cut out the larger holes. I did this because they took more pressure than the smaller ones, and obviously it's stronger when it has less holes in it. Compared to the larger weird-shaped holes, it was pretty trivial to cut out the small rectangles. I also covered the corrugation on the inside of the larger holes because the little rectangles really didn't need it. I capped the ends of the tube, one with a hole like this for the barrel, and one with just a ring of thin cardboard to cover the corrugation. There also appears to be a knurled lock nut or something on the end nearest the receiver, so I made that using a ring of cardboard surrounded by a strip with the corrugation showing. The barrel is a long tube of paper layered several times to give it thickness and rigidity. I decided to make the model with a 26-inch barrel, so I made my barrel 26 inches long. The real gun is free-floated, so I made sure that it didn't touch the inside of the tube, but you can use struts if you must. The muzzle device was just a small piece of uncorrugated cardboard with holes cut in it in this shape and position, with a little cap on the end. Then I looked over the whole assembly to make sure everything lined up and looked good. Next, with no shortage of hot glue, I slapped on the whole thing to the end of the gun and looked it over. The reason I do that is because I realized I was missing a bit. If you take a look at the real one, the edge of the magwell's kind of flared, so I decided to take these parts here and glue them on like this. For a little bit of extra detail, I made the safety levers. I put one on each side. I'm not sure if the real gun has one on each side or if it's only a right or left-handed one, but I think they look cool on both, so that's what I did. I also used small bits of uncorrugated cardboard to very tediously and carefully cut out the shape of the trigger, and this is what it looks like where I put the trigger and where I put the safety levers. I added these other little details to each side of the tube, and I was done with the main part of the gun. I was not, however, done with the build. I still had to make the magazine and the scope, so I started with this piece here as a stencil and used it to trace this part. I did this pretty much the same way I did the cheek rest. I traced it on one side, skipped a little bit, and flipped it over. Next I cut out this shape here, which is going to be the pattern on the bottom of the magazine. After I made a strip of cardboard into the back of the magazine and attached that part, this is what it looked like. I also used a very thin strip of cardboard to wrap around the bottom of the magazine to give it a little bit more depth. Next I just went ahead and covered the whole bottom of the magazine. I decided to detail the top of the magazine a little bit more this time, so I cut this shape and pinched the edges to make the feed lips. I also created these 2 shapes which will become the follower. After covering the corrugation on the edges of the follower and gluing them together, I attached them in like this. And that was the completed magazine. Once again, I looked over the whole gun just to make sure everything was lined up and the way I wanted it. Now, the scope I made is not based on any real one. It was just what I thought looked cool, so none of this is really to be followed to a T. If you think you can make a scope look better or look more the way you want it, go for it. That said, I started out mine with this tube, which will become the tube. For the bell of the objective, I made this shape here that I will turn into a cone. I'll then trim the cone so that the small end of it is the same size as the tube. This will allow me to slide it over easily and tightly without leaving too much of a gap or seam. The larger cylinder at the end of the objective will be these two pieces here, a ring and a strip that I'm going to wrap around it. I also added a ring on the other side for support. I then simply glued it onto the end of the bell. Now, I added a little strip there to cover the seam because I think it looks better. For the part on the tube that's going to have all of the adjustment knobs attached to it, I started with these two octagons with holes cut in them and a strip, and these two little rings, which will go on either side. After wrapping the octagons with the strip, I slipped all three pieces onto the tube. The scope rings started out as 4 of this shape, which I then covered with small strips of cardboard and cut in half. The windage, elevation, and parallax adjustment knobs all started out as these 3 circles, which I wrapped with strips of cardboard. I also removed the top layer of a few strips to leave the corrugation showing for some knurling on the outside of each of the cylinders. Next, I just glued them on to the sides of that octagon. For the eyepiece side, I started out by wrapping a strip of cardboard around the end to give it a little bit more girth, as well as added a zoom adjust knob in the form of some coarser corrugation wrapped around the tube. I also put on these 2 more strips for a focus adjust and then just an eyepiece ring that looks neat. The scope mount started out as these 3 pieces, which I'm going to put together so that they slip onto the rail on top of the gun. This is the shape that I made the base. If you want to make more than one optic to put on the gun, you can do that. I suggest making that part much longer and then cutting it down to sizes for whatever little bit you need, instead of making it over and over again. This is the shape I used for the bracket that will attach to the base and the scope rings. Here I've attached the lower part of the scope rings to the bracket. Next, after attaching the bracket to the base, I leveled the scope in the scope rings and then glued that on too. The last step was simply to glue the other half of the scope rings on top. I left a little bit of a gap because that's how the real ones would be too. That said, the gap would be a little bit more consistent, I suppose. And with that, I was all done. Despite the video being only about 18 minutes long, this gun took me a long time. So don't expect to do it quickly yourself if you want any good results. The best advice I can give is work when you feel like it, don't force yourself, and don't rush. And if something doesn't come out the way you want it to, don't be afraid to remake it. You'll be happier in the long run. So thank you all for watching. I hope I was able to help you guys out in some way or another. And this is Magicalamazing, signing off till next time. See y'all later.